Preacher King Duncan tells the following story of an event that occurred at one church's Christmas Eve service a number of years ago. He writes, "A mother took her 3-year-old daughter to church for the very first time. The church was having its annual Christmas Eve candlelight service. The church lights were lowered and the choir came down the aisle carrying lighted candles. All was perfectly quiet until this 3-year-old started to sing in a very loud voice, 'Happy birthday to you.' I guess it was a candlelight, as apparently it all just seemed like a birthday party to the little girl. Needless to say, the very solemn, dignified opening of worship that the pastor and the music director had planned was ruined, as throughout the congregation people struggled not to snicker. But suddenly members of the choir began to turn to one another as if all having the same idea at the same time, and with that, they proceeded to lead the congregation in singing in 4-part harmony, 'Happy Birthday to Jesus.' It's not exactly the start of worship that had been planned, but it was perhaps the most fitting one possible. What the holiday was and is truly all about, a spontaneous, joyful birthday celebration, the royal birth announcement that is Christmas. This is something of what I'd like to explore this morning. Today, in our continuing look at great Christian music, the hymn we're considering is Hark, the Herald Angels Sing. And for this hymn, we Methodists can take particular pride, for it was written by one of the founders of Methodism, namely Charles Wesley. In the early 1700s, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was completely out of touch with the needs of the world outside its walls, and particularly the needs of the poor, poverty being rampant in 18th century England. And 2 Anglican priests, 2 brothers, John and Charles Wesley, were deeply disturbed by this, and so they began a movement to reform Christianity in England, particularly in regards to social action, getting out and actually caring for and helping the needy. Those who opposed their efforts gave the group the nickname the Methodists, because the members were so methodical in their work. And the title was originally a put-down, but the early Methodists took it as a badge of honor. Yes, indeed, they were very methodical, very thoughtful, and organized in their good deeds, and so the name stuck. Why do you think we have all these meetings all the time? Right? Because we're Methodists, and that's what we do. We are methodical, right? Well, the Wesleys never intended to start a new denomination. Their goal was simply to reform the Church of England, but eventually those in authority within the church declared them as outcasts. And the primary leader of this new movement was John, and Charles effectively became the music director. Now remember, this was a time of widespread poverty and illiteracy, so how do you teach people the basics of faith, people who can't read? Well, you teach them through song. You set ideas to music through which the ideas are easily remembered. Thus, the Methodist Church became known as the Singing Church. Charles Wesley wrote over 4,000 hymns during his lifetime, hymns that are used by Christians of all denominations today, and our hymn today being one of the most popular Christmas carols of all time. Written in 1739, Hark, the Herald Angels Sing is a classic Wesley hymn in that it is cram-packed with deep theology. There is never any light stuff with Wesley. Just think about how the hymn begins. Hark, the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King, peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconcile. In just the opening line, Wesley gets right down to what this is all about, the whole event of Jesus Christ, the reconciliation of God and sinful humanity. That is, Christmas is not just about warm feelings and lighted trees and presents and parties. It is about the healing of the broken relationship between God and humankind. Wesley then goes on to explore this idea in the hymn, touching upon the topics of eternal life, incarnation, virgin birth, healing, salvation, being born again, all in just 3 verses. It is classic Wesley in that it is overflowing with ideas centered around this theme of salvation, God's ministry of reconciliation, opposing parties brought together in Jesus Christ. And in this, it's very interesting to consider some of the twists and turns in the history of this hymn. To begin with, the music that we sing this carol to is not the music Wesley originally intended for it. He originally saw this as a very serious hymn, and so he said it's very somber music, and in this form the hymn never took off. However, a few years after Wesley wrote it, a musician named William Cummings took some music by the classical composer Felix Mendelssohn, music which Mendelssohn had written for a secular cantata celebrating the work of Gutenberg and the printing press, but music which Mendelssohn said would never be appropriate for sacred use. Well, Cummings put Wesley's words to Mendelssohn's music, ironically connecting the Wesley's tireless work in the field of literacy to Gutenberg and the printing press, and it stuck. But most experts say that both the lyricist and the composer would not have approved. Very upset. Beyond this, the poetry alone takes a curious path. In the mid-1700s, a publisher in England was putting together a new book of common prayer for the Church of England. He had some space to fill, and he happened to come upon this nice little poem by some guy named Wesley, and so he put it in. Now, as mentioned, as far as the leadership of the Church of England was concerned, the Wesleys were on the outs, right? They couldn't have a Wesley poem in the church's new book of prayer. Well, when the error was discovered, attempts were made to have it removed, but the poem proved so popular with everyday people that it was allowed to remain. And thus, the Wesleys' ideas got in where they themselves were not allowed to go. But even this is not the end of the great hymn story. The most important event happens early on. Wesley's original refrain was this: "Hark how all the welkin rings, glory to the newborn King." The word welkin is an Old English word. It means the sky or the heavens. And so Wesley's original idea is that all the heavens ringing forth, with the birth of Christ. But early on, a prominent preacher at the time, George Whitefield, didn't like this line, so he changed it to what we now know it as, "Hark the herald angels sing." And what's funny about this is that Whitefield and the Wesleys couldn't get along with each other. They were the two biggest names in the religious world at the time, and they had begun as close friends, but they had had a serious falling out over issues of faith, and thus were constantly arguing about theology, often declaring each other to be downright evil, totally wrong about faith in Jesus Christ. For artistic and personal reasons, Wesley did not approve of Whitefield's change, but it stuck. Thus forever, two opposing sides, Whitefield's words and Wesley's theology, are joined together to him. And notice that this is basically the overriding theme of the entire history of this hymn. It is reconciliation. Opposing sides, differing factions being brought together, forced together, united. The history of the hymn itself, oddly playing out the primary message of the hymn itself: reconciliation. God and sinners reconciled. Those who are out being brought in. And in this, notice why Whitefield's change is so particularly important. As mentioned, Wesley's original words sang just a kind of a general celebration of the heavens. But in changing the words to "Hark the herald angels sing," the song now focuses upon a specific moment in the story of salvation. The moment described in our text this morning, when on a hill overlooking Bethlehem, the messenger angels announced Jesus' birth. And who did they announce it to? Who were the first to be notified? Some shepherds. And this is crucial. As we have noted in the past, we tend to have this kind of beautiful pastoral image of shepherds, but in Jesus' day this was simply not the case. In ancient times, shepherds were considered to be the lowest of the low, unclean, smelly, kind of shiftless and shady characters. Yet the royal birth announcement is sent to them first, not to any world leaders, not to any religious authorities, not to certain pious, good people, but to some shepherds hanging out at work. This is where God goes first. And why? Because this is what Jesus is all about. The out being brought in, relationship healing. God and sinners reconciled. It's all about reconciliation. And so in this, what does the reconciling birth announcement of Jesus said first to some shepherds 2,000 years ago, as reinforced in our hymn today, mean to say to us this morning? What message does it have for us in this Advent season? Now, a couple of thoughts this morning. First, the birth announcement that the herald angels sang tells us that we are loved. Obviously, this is where we began. By sending the angels first to some shepherds, it is God's way of saying to everyone, everywhere, to each one of us, that no matter what, within you or beyond you, says that you are outside of the love of God, rejected, evil, wrong, hopeless. God says, that is not how I see you. I come for you. I give my son to you. This is all for you. The first message we are meant to hear from the herald angels, that no matter what we have done, it is not held against us. We are loved, and in God's sight, we are not tied to yesterday. We can be brand new today because he has come to share our lives and to take our wrongs from us onto himself. Born to raise us from the earth, born to give us second birth, Wesley says, pleased with us in flesh to dwell, Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us. God with us, not against us, right? One author writes, once upon a time, a grandfather stopped by his daughter's house to visit his young grandson. When he arrived there, he found his grandson jumping up and down in his playpen, crying at the top of his lungs. As soon as the small boy spotted his grandfather, he reached up his chubby little hands and began calling, "Out, Gramps, out!" As was only natural, the grandfather began to reach down to lift the boy out of the playpen. But just as he was about to do so, the mother of the child stepped up and said, "No, Timmy, you are being punished. You must stay in." The grandfather was at a loss to know what to do. The child's tears and calls and chubby little uplifted hands reached deep into his heart. But the mother's firmness in correcting her son's errors could not be dismissed. What was he to do? He had no idea. Then suddenly it came to him. He couldn't take his grandson out of the playpen, but he couldn't stand to leave him there either, so he did the only thing he could do. He climbed into the playpen with him. And the two of them had a grand old time. The message, love found a way. Right? So it is with Jesus. Punishment was rightly pending. But the Father's love was so great he couldn't stand to leave it that. So he climbed in here with us and had a grand old time. The message of Christmas. What wrong, what failure plagues you, holds life back from you every day? The birth announcement of Jesus is first meant to tell us that we are loved, no matter what. From this then, secondly, it tells us that this is where where life is found. As mentioned at the very outset of the hymn, Wesley makes it clear that what the whole thing is going to be about. God and sinners reconciled. In other words, again, the saving work begun at Christmas is not about warm, fuzzy, sentimental thoughts. It is about confronting our sin and forming a relationship with God and Jesus Christ. He who comes to take our sins from us, that we might truly be in relationship with the Lord. The announcement going first to the shepherds, then reinforcing this fact. Not going to world leaders or religious authorities, but to average Joes, most especially outcasts, making it clear that it is for each of us, our outer status apart from God, that must ultimately be addressed here. To put it another way, the second point here is this. It's seeing that this is what we must ultimately address in life if we are to find life. We must address our relationship with God and anything that stands between that relationship. Everything hinges on this. If we don't get this, the rest of it is pointless. If we do get this, the rest of it falls into line. But you see, this is often the last thing on our Christmas list. In fact, generally, we think getting our life together is about everything but this. What we need, Lord, what I need is a little more money, or a better job, or some health problem taken care of, or economy to turn around, whatever. Everything but forming a living relationship with God and confronting my sin. Right? As one scholar writes, these days people tend to reduce things to the temporal and the physical. But it's curious. When Jesus came, he could have brought political peace and delivered Israel from Roman rule. He could have put money in everyone's pockets. He could have fed all the hungry and healed all the sick. But he didn't. Because our greatest problem isn't physical or political or financial. It is spiritual. And until we address this, we will never get better. Let's face it, we often think this is the thing we least have to address, or at least try to convince ourselves of that, We may not be perfect, right? But we're better than most, and so we're good enough, In the extreme, I'm reminded of a letter a little boy once sent to Santa. The letter read, "Dear Santa, there are 3 boys at my house. Jeffrey is 2, David is 4, and Stephen is 7. Jeffrey is good some of the time, David is good most of the time, but Stephen is good all the time. P.S. I am Stephen, I await my presents." Well, I got news for you, Stephen. Nobody bats 1,000, right? But you can see the thought, can't you? I don't need all this. Maybe others do. They're messed up. I just need a few things, Lord, to make my life perfect. I can handle the rest perfectly fine on my own. Thank you very much. A very common sentiment. Basically, I don't really need the serious religious stuff. Just let me keep it down as minimal as possible. I'm good enough. All I need is enough faith to get my prayers answered today. The rest I will take care of myself. Thank you. We don't want a real claim of the Lord upon our lives. We just like a superficial acknowledgement of it. The problem is God didn't come into the world as a vending machine. He came into the world as Jesus, as a baby, as an infant that immediately had to be cradled in human arms. Jesus is God in relationship, right? It's what the whole thing is about. And if we miss this, we miss the whole thing. Conversely, however, if we embrace it, we embrace the whole thing. God is saying in the birth announcement of Jesus Christ, he's saying, just want me, will you? And drive away everything that stands in the way of that. Any bitterness or pride or stubbornness or selfishness or power or control, whatever. Just want me and everything will be yours. The second message of this hymn in this text. This Christmas, are you seeking Jesus or something else? Even more pointedly, what stands between you and God? How are you not right with God and you know it? And are you willing to let God address this? You can do everything else you want this holiday season. You can decorate your house. You can sing all the hymns. You can give away tons of presents. But if you do not address this, the whole thing will be pointless. This is where we must go to find Jesus, because this is where he goes to save us. Christian author Paul Richardson writes, "There it stood, the best tree in the lot. It was the second Christmas of our married life, and with newlywed-like impulse, we decided to forego the 2-foot-high plastic tree that graced our coffee table the year before. We had found a perfect tree instead. It was wide at the base and came to a perfect point on top. With blissful Christmas cheer, we paid the $25 and maneuvered it onto the roof of our '77 Chevy Citation and drove to our apartment. I cleared a spot next to the couch and set it up in the corner. At least I tried to set it up in the corner. Our perfect tree immediately fell, turning our tree stand into green and red scrap metal. Another tree stand and multiple attempts only brought about the same problem. The tree just wouldn't stand up. When I probed into the forest of green needles, I discovered our perfect tree had a huge flaw. The base of the tree began straight and centered, but the middle of the tree contorted in pretzel-like twist, bending this way and that, but coming out straight at the top. It was perfect on the outside, but hopelessly flawed within, and it could never stand on its own. In our not-so-perfect Christmas tree, I saw the whole story of Christmas. On the outside, we like to show that we have it all together. 'Tis the season to be jolly. But inside, we know differently. Hurts, pain, anger, bitterness. Worse yet, that there is that contortion of our souls that the Bible calls sin. No matter how many ornaments Lisa and I hung on our tree, we knew it could never stand on its own. And no matter how many ornaments we attach to our lives, we can never be right without Jesus on our own. You know, the Christmas story is not about seeing how nice we were and God coming down to spend time with some sweet, nice people. It is the story of God seeing twisted, hurting, sinful people who cannot stand on their own and coming down to die for us. God came to save us from our sin. And we only experience that salvation when we confront that sin. Are we willing to go there this Christmas? Christmas birth announcement is secondly meant to tell us that this alone is where life is found. All of which brings us to finally, thirdly, a warning that we can either be part of the problem or we can be part of the solution. In the end, simply put, in the birth announcement of the Son, God goes first to the outs, thus directing us to have to see that this is something we all so often sadly do. We separate. We declare certain people out, personally and collectively. The message of the angels: this is not what God does, and neither should we. Jesus comes for a ministry of reconciliation and calls us to do exactly the same. The text in the hymn finally challenges all those ways in our own hearts that we cast others out, declare them outside the love of God, and it calls us to fight within ourselves against any way that this occurs within us. You know, basically, the final challenge of this hymn is this: it's to ask, who am I at odds with this holiday season? And will I, above everything else, seek to love them and help them to experience Jesus Christ? Do this, and you get the whole season. In an article entitled "Christmas as Mysterious as Ever," author Doris Sweeler writes, "There once was a very difficult little girl. Her name was Phyllis, and the woman who was her Sunday school teacher tells this story about her. She says, Phyllis wasn't an easy child to love. Sometimes I did wish she wasn't in the particular Sunday school class that I taught. She never sat still. She hated to be touched, and she always had to have the last word on everything. Well, her teacher tried to give Phyllis a speaking part in the annual Christmas pageant, but Phyllis refused. I'm probably going to a party that night, she said grandly, and her teacher's first thought was, thank goodness. But then something deep within her moved her to say, Lord, this Christmas, please help me to love Phyllis. Recalls the teacher. I said to Phyllis, well, I do have a few more parts if you change your mind. I won't, Phyllis said, and she didn't. At the rehearsal, the teacher continues, I heard, Mary doesn't act like she's going to have a baby, muttered by a husky little voice behind me. Phyllis might not have any desire to be in the program, but she certainly wouldn't miss any of the rehearsals. Shh, I whispered, reaching back to pat Phyllis's hand. She jerked it away, saying, okay. I was having enough problems already. I didn't need this. Lord, please help me to love Phyllis. In the last scene, only a spotlight shone on the Holy Family and the children hummed Silent Night. It was beautiful. But who was that moving in front of the manger? It's Phyllis. You never knew where that child was going to pop up next. Now she stuck her hand into the manger, squeezed the doll's arm, and disappeared back into the shadows. Phyllis, I called, what are you doing up there? I'm just looking, she said. Besides, it's not a real baby, it's just a doll. I felt it. Oh Lord, please help me to love Phyllis. Come Christmas Eve, by 6:45, the air was bristling with excitement backstage. There was no Phyllis to be seen, and I began to relax. As the organ chimed the beginning of the service, I took my proper seat, the front pew, and with the opening strains of Watchmen Tell Us of the Night, the lights came up on the manger scene and the narrator began. I felt something bump my knee and give me a little shove. Move over, muttered that all too familiar voice. I decided not to go to the party, Phyllis said. The angels sang to the shepherds went to Bethlehem and took a lamb for the baby, the wise men went to see Herod and then to the stable. Mary sat there pondering these things in her heart. Cues were being missed, lines dropped, the whole thing was a bit of a mess. I was kicking myself inside, but it was what it was. Phyllis sat beside me so quietly that I forgot all about her, and when I realized she was gone, it was too late. Before I could react, she had stomped her way right up to the manger, just as she had done during rehearsal. But this time she stiffened, awestruck, then turned, eyes wide with wonder, and she came hurrying back to me. He's alive, she said to me in a penetrating whisper. What she didn't realize was that for the actual performance, the doll playing Jesus at rehearsal had been replaced by a living baby from one of the families in the congregation. Across the aisle, someone asked, "What did she say? What did she say?" The reply came, "She said he's alive." Like ripples in a pond, the word passed from pew to pew to pew, all the way to the back of the sanctuary. He's alive. He's alive. He's alive. At that, a spontaneous round of applause erupted from the congregation with many shouting, "He's alive!" And I put my arm around Phyllis. "You were the best part of the program," I whispered into her ear. Remarkably, for once not pushing me away, she replied, "But I wasn't in the program." And I thought, "Yes, you were, child. You were what the whole thing was about." And in all, it was the best Christmas I had ever known, because I shared it with Phyllis. Hark, the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. The royal birth announcement of our Savior Jesus Christ delivered first to some shepherds, reminding us all this Christmas that we are loved, that this is where we must go to find life, and that we can either be part of the problem or we can be part of the solution.